No matter your thoughts on the Great Resignation, or as some call it, the Great Reshuffle, recruiting and hiring has become as important as ever. With an unmatched enthusiasm for the contact center business and over 2 decades of experience, Matt Beckwith shares insights on how to improve the recruiting and hiring process this week on Next in Queue. We talk about why recruiting and hiring is so important for contact centers and how it's changed since the pandemic began, the biggest opportunity in contact center recruiting and hiring, how technology may be impeding your recruiting efforts, why new hires should not start on Mondays, and how your contact center can become an employer of choice in your market. Let's get to it.
Welcome to Next in Queue, the podcast for contact center and customer experience professionals. Next in Queue is brought to you by Happy2, your service team's personal coach, giving them the process, resources, and insights to deliver the perfect customer experience over the phone. Learn more at happitu.com. Now, here's your host, Rob Dwyer.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining another episode of Next in Queue. Today, Matt Beckwith is joining me. Hey Matt, how are you?
I'm doing good, Rob. How are you?
I am fantastic. We had a good time just before we hopped on here talking about some of our sports heroes in the past. Fun fact, even though you're a Northern California guy, you actually spent some time near my neck of the woods. But let's talk about kind of your history before we get started. We're going to talk about hiring and recruiting and all of that stuff. But before we get started, tell us a little bit about yourself, kind of how you got to where you are today.
So I am in Northern California my entire life, except for, as I mentioned before, I did a little stint in college in Missouri. Big fan of the growing up of the Kansas City Chiefs, and so I was thrilled to spend a little bit of time in Missouri. I always say I'm going to go back and take my wife and family out there, but it hasn't yet happened. But I've been here in Northern California for, like I said, my entire life, where my wife and I have raised a wonderful family. I've successfully deployed 2 daughters into the real world, and they have deployed a couple of grandkids. So I got a couple of promotions in the last several years, and I've been in the contact center business what feels like my entire life, from a chance missed interview at another company. Then I got steered into the contact center world, and I have never looked back. And it's been like, I don't know, 27 or 28 years.
That I've never heard anyone talk about their kids as being deployed into the world, but I love it, and I may have to steal that. So,
well, I use that. I stole it from somebody years ago when I heard it, and I thought, when I met my wife and we started talking about our family ambitions, and I said, I want 2 daughters. I don't want 3. I don't want 1. I want 4. I don't want boys. I want 2 daughters. And having mostly brothers and 1 sister, I always wanted to have daughters. So that's why I say I successfully deployed them on time, a little over budget. But very, very proud of them both.
they're always over budget. They're always over
Well,
budget.
just wait until the grandkids. They're even way more over budget.
Hey, we don't need to rush things here, Matt. Just park that horse in the barn for right now.
There you go.
So let's talk about hiring and recruiting. I mean, this is a hot topic. I think not just for contact centers. We have been hearing about hiring challenges, about retention challenges in a variety of industries, really since the pandemic began. And now here we are, we're, kind of late 2022. And there are a lot of things have changed from, in many cases, pay structure, but there are still a lot of challenges in hiring and retaining good talent. So we're going to talk about the hiring part today. So let's just kind of start and maybe get a baseline out there. Like, why is recruiting and hiring so important for contact centers?
Well, I mean, clearly, in every contact center that I've been involved in, it is the number one expense. It surpasses the expense for technology, often surpasses the expense for facilities. But it is the greatest cost. And even if you're a revenue generating profit center, you are very mindful of what it takes to run your operation. And so anytime you hire somebody, obviously it costs a ton of money to hire and train and onboard. And then if you are continuously doing that, then that has negative impacts on the business. So anytime you can stretch out the amount of time and people will want to work with you and be successful in your organization, the more beneficial it is to the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly just the training part, right? That's the time when agents are really only a cost and they are not generating revenue for the company. Depending on your business, that training time may run from a few days to quite a number of weeks. I have seen some training that lasts the better part of 2 months. And that's a lot of time to be paying people that are not generating any revenue.
Well, and the other thing is you bring this up, but I'm always amazed at how many operations don't measure this. And this is a measurable thing. And so in my organizations, we measure it as TTP, so time to productivity, right? And so how much time does it take to be productive? And I don't mean how long does it take for an employee to get fully trained and then take their first call. Now, the day they take their first call, even if they have a team of people behind them that are supporting them, they have begun their journey to productivity, but they are not there yet. And so all of the front-loaded cost for recruiting and going through the interview process and all the amount of time it takes for that, and you're taking other people in the organization out of their normal role to do this thing, to participate in this recruiting and this hiring. At some point, you need to know what that number is. And so in my last organization, training was a couple of months. And we knew exactly how long it would take for people to become productive, which is why we always said, it doesn't matter if it normally takes 2 months, if it takes one person 2 months and 2 weeks, why do we care? We're going to be paid that back eventually. But understanding how to measure that, that's the first thing. And most organizations that I have been a part of, and most people I've talked to, don't actually measure that. They don't have a number where they can say, we know that it takes 17 and a half weeks to get a fully productive employee, kind of soup to nuts. And that is, you're right, even if it's, and I've been in organizations where training was a couple of weeks, and I've been in organizations where training is several weeks. And there's a lot can be said for, if you make that training too short, you generally don't have much success down the road. But at least measuring it and having a yardstick to make some improvements on is super important.
Yeah, and you bring up some other key points, right? There are so many people involved in getting that agent to productivity. So it starts with the people that are tasked with recruiting. And that includes people doing the interviewing, which, depending on your organization, may be the recruiting department. It could be someone in operations who has a job to do outside of
Right.
Doing interviews. Then you have trainers, which I've seen organizations where you don't have dedicated trainers, right? So you're pulling people out of production to facilitate that. And then when you're kind of in that incubation stage, right? When you're first taking those calls, most organizations use some type of incubation stage where there's some additional support. And again, that additional support is coming out of production. So there's just so much involved in supporting people to get there, in addition to all the things that you're just waiting on them to get to where they need to be.
Exactly.
So I mentioned that we've been hearing a lot about hiring challenges since the pandemic began. I'm wondering, from your perspective, has it changed recruiting and hiring practices? And if so, how?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. In the very beginning, it was pure pandemonium, right? So everybody pretty much, especially in our industry, can put that marker. I think it was around week 17 of 2020 where everybody said, we're all going home, right? It was either that Friday, the ominous Friday the 13th of March, or the 15th, the 16th, the 17th of the following week. Everybody has the same story. They went home. And then when they started needing to ramp up, figuring out how do we take this, what used to be in most cases, and certainly for me in the organization I was in, it was brick and mortar 100%. How do we move from brick and mortar interview process to a non-brick and mortar interview process, and understanding the technology needs of the potential candidates, and then how are you searching for them, and how are you marketing that? And again, because once everybody started hiring again, then their ability, or the opportunities for certainly a contact center representative were far greater than they were before, because they could work anywhere. And even if they were regionally based, it said if you needed to be on the West Coast, or you need to be in the East Coast, or this time zone, tons of more competition. And that had a drastic impact. Some organizations didn't do well in moving that brick and mortar recruitment or any of their processes, but certainly in the beginning, the front door, the recruitment and the hiring and the training. How do we move that from brick and mortar to the virtual? And that was the biggest challenge. And certainly the biggest challenge that we faced was, how do we deliberately think about these things and make them work better in this environment rather than in the old brick and mortar? And that took us some time. We had some bumps and bruises, maybe some bloody noses and black eyes, and then we said, okay, we're gonna get better at this. And eventually we did, and we hired a ton during the pandemic and got really good at it. But yeah, I think it was a challenge for many organizations, not just contact centers, but certainly, as we've seen, contact center employees still work remotely, a great deal of them. So continuing that and getting really good at that process has been key.
Yeah. I think a lot of people forget, right? We talk a lot about work at home, and I think people forget that recruiting and hiring from home has its own unique set of challenges that go with it. If
Yeah,
you've always been a brick and mortar company, day one is when you're collecting, in the US at least, collecting IDs for
yeah,
I-9 and
yeah,
all of that stuff, right? And if you're hiring work at home people that are, quote unquote remote, you have to solve for that. And there are tools out there that solve for that.
yeah.
But if you didn't already have that in place or weren't thinking about that, and then all of a sudden the demand for those tools goes through the roof, it can really throw up some
Yeah,
challenges.
and the other thing is I want to go back to one thing that you said about work from home, and that was, in the beginning, everybody said, "Okay, new mindset. We're going from brick and mortar to work from home." And one of the things that we learned very early on was we need to make a distinction. We're going to put an asterisk on that, because work from home is not necessarily what you might be getting, or what you need, or what you want, or what your team members can provide. You have to be very careful and think, is this a work from anywhere? Because that's different. Is this a work from, is this solely only remote? Does that mean that they can go work in a WeWork? Does that mean they can go work in a Starbucks? Does that mean that they can get a MiFi and go work in their car? Does that mean that they can travel to their family member's house in another state or in another country? And so all of these things, you have to stop and think, no, let's get very specific about what this means. And clearly, I remember doing a work from home pilot many, many years ago in the healthcare space. And we said, okay, so we have to have a dedicated room with a lock. The door has to be shut, those kinds of things. But not every industry is doing that. And so really getting granular and very deliberate on what the organization means from work from home. And that starts from the recruitment. Like, what does your job posting say? How do you describe that in the interview? And I think that has been that was a learning point as well.
Yeah. Your industry really can dictate some of the requirements that have to be in place for that to be successful.
Oh,
So certainly healthcare, right? Highly regulated, or if you're in financial industry, highly regulated. That's going to be very different than if you were just maybe doing some customer care for an e-commerce site or something like that.
yeah.
And as an organization, you definitely have to take those things into account when you're thinking
Yeah.
about what your requirements are. So it's really great stuff. Obviously, it's still a challenge. We're still hearing about it. What are the mistakes that some organizations are making today when it comes to their recruiting? So we already talked about, right, being very granular with your requirements in your job posting, but what other issues are plaguing some organizations?
Well, the one that gets me all fired up, and I think about this all the time. So, for the last 25 plus years, I've called a contact center almost every day of my life. And probably for 15 plus years of it, it was several times a day because I had a long commute. And that, getting that that intel, it's anecdotal, right? But it's anecdotal intel. I think that's an oxymoron, but getting that kind of for many, many, many years has taught me so much about this industry. But the other thing is when the pandemic started, I really thought, wait, we should be doing this on the candidate experience side. We should be looking at how everybody else are posting jobs and what their systems are, right? And so early on, I thought, again, when we talk about moving from brick and mortar to purely virtual recruiting, hiring, onboarding, and training, thinking, what are other companies doing? Because if you're in the market and you're trying to hire a class of 25 new customer service representatives or sales representatives, they can go, as I said earlier, they can go anywhere. Not now, if you're in a small community, maybe there's 5 other places they can go, but now they can go to 500 different places. And understanding what those other organizations are doing is so important to understanding kind of what your drop off rate is. Every contact center leader understands what their abandonment, knows the importance of that abandonment rate, and you can schedule to your abandonment rate and what your customer threshold for pain is and things like that. But do you know what your candidate abandonment rate is? Do you know what the processes you're putting your candidates through? And it always shocks me when I talk to contact center leaders, especially that are recruiting for agents. I ask them, what's the process? Like, what system are you using? Are you using Greenhouse, using Indeed? Are you only using LinkedIn? Are you using I just saw a job bot or one of these sites, and have you walked through that process yourself? And oftentimes, like, I have no idea. Like, I get a list from my recruiter, and that's who I call. But what about the people that are applying that are not that are abandoning? Like, just in ecom, we talk about abandoned shopping carts, and contact centers we talk about abandoned calls. What about abandoned candidates? And that number, if your HR recruiting team is not giving you that number, then you should ask for it, because that might be eye-opening. Everybody in this industry that I've met has read or is very familiar with the work of Matt Dixon and the book, The Effortless Experience, and the effect that effort has on customer satisfaction and loyalty. Well, the same can apply to candidates and potential candidates in the candidate experience. And I think about if you have a job posting and the form asks them to do, create a new login and fill out, a 20 question questionnaire, and then they have to upload docs in a certain format, and then they have to get another link and go. Like, if you're causing this effort, then you're going to have abandoned candidates. It has to be true. But if you can reduce the effort, and again, the old days of just mail in your resume are gone. And I understand that there's this signal versus noise trade-off. So if you just say, give me everything, then you're going to get a lot of noise. But if you have good processes in place and good scoring criteria, then you can take that, you can separate the wheat from the chaff, to use another metaphor. But so many organizations are trying to hire and trying to hire. Another problem is they're trying to hire tomorrow instead of planning it and trying to hire in
Yeah.
6 months. But if they're trying to hire tomorrow, and then they their company's guidelines says you have to go through this form, answer these questions. And I say to the hiring manager, what can you do to make that more simple, to reduce the effort? And the more you can reduce the effort, the more likely you're going to get more applications. And that is that is going to help you. And I believe, and this is purely anecdotal, but the pandemic caused far more virtual hiring. And that virtual hiring meant there's a ton of new technology providers in that space. And those new companies are the ones that are understanding if we reduce that amount of effort or friction from the candidate side, the experience will be, or for the amount of applications or resumes that the company will get will go up. And I think that's something that oftentimes most hiring managers, because they're in a brick and mortar mindset, aren't thinking, what does the front door look like? I just care about what applications come to me, but they should be looking at what that front door looks like.
Yeah. You brought up something that I think is honestly a little shocking sometimes, because in the contact center, we have to be pretty good at forecasting when it comes to volume. And we also have to be good at forecasting our future staffing needs. And that includes, right, understanding kind of what our attrition is, what maybe seasonality factors we have, so that we can plan ahead of time. Hey, I know I'm going to have to bring in new hires on X date, so that they're ready and productive by the time I know this volume is going to show up, or I know that this attrition is going to impact my staffing. So not everyone is great at that, but that needs to be part of the conversation for sure.
Not only are not everybody great at that, but I always ask, anytime somebody is responsible, the workforce people, they understand this. But if the rest of the contact center organization, I always ask them, do you measure things like MAPE? Like, I prefer to look at MAPE, mean absolute percentage error. And I say, we've made a forecast for the year. We finalized it. We might have gotten a rough draft in September, October, November, but in December it's final, and we pretty much know what our volume is going to be. And from the team that does that, we look and say, okay, in week 4 to week 7, what was your mean absolute percentage error? What were you 3% off, or were you 12% off? If you were 12% off, was there something in the business that we didn't predict? Was there something that we can then go back and say, oh, this is going to change the rest of our year? And most organizations don't measure that. And that is a crucial number, especially when it's the only way to forecast, or to know how well your forecast is. But the other thing is, like I said, Rob, I call a contact center every day, practically, of my life. And I can't tell you how many contact centers from March of 2020 until still today, although it's far fewer today, you'll hear the recording in the auto attendant or the IVR that says, due to heightened call volume because of the pandemic, wait times may be longer. And I'm thinking, okay, in the very beginning, and I was thinking about cycle time, right? So when I called you in March of 2020, you said that. I get it. Crazy volume. Maybe your industry was impacted, or you lost a lot of employees, or something. But or you had a reduction in force. But then if 6 months later, or 9 months later, a year later, you're still doing that, you have just, and I promise you, nobody knows that message is still being played, and nobody hears it. It is the worst thing to hear today. Because of the pandemic, wait times will be longer than expected. We apologize. And I said, I call contact centers all the time. So I will tell you that most of the time that I hear that, the delay is nothing. Like, I heard it just yesterday, and it didn't say the pandemic, but it said, due to recent events, which is the same thing that they've been playing for 2 years, wait times will be longer than expected. We apologize for the delay. And as soon as it finished, it heard the little ring and somebody answered. I was like, there's no delay. It was a 6-second wait time. But yeah, and everybody's doing that, and they don't get a pass. They do not. It's been 2 years. You should be able to forecast your volume.
2.5 years, right?
Yeah, 2.5 years.
It's been 30 months at this point.
It's a lifetime ago.
Yeah, you should have figured it out by now. Yeah, I do think that people, some organizations, use that as an excuse for what other issues they may be experiencing. By the way, like, can I just say, I have always told agents that no one calls contact centers just for fun. And apparently I'm wrong because you exist.
Well, I used to say that people never call contact centers just to say thank you, you're doing a great job. But that was before I got into the pest control industry. When I worked in the pest control industry for almost 9 years, we got calls every single day. Literally every single day, somebody would call. People would call, not just somebody. We're an organization that took 1 million contacts a year, and every day we were getting calls that said, "I just wanted to say thank you to my technician," or "I just wanted to just give, literally just to give kudos." And in my previous experience in healthcare and telecom and banking, financial services, that certainly never happened. But yeah, there is at least one person calling for fun all the time.
Yeah, I will say that has to be like the best environment when most of your calls are people saying thank you, thank you, thank
Well, maybe
you.
not most, but I mean, there are some, and that's never happened in any other industry, partly
uh,
because every other industry has created so many barriers to get into a human that nobody would ever do it.
well, having had an ant problem taken care of by my pest control company, I understand where they're
Awesome.
coming from because
Awesome. Those are big deals.
they
Hey, I
are.
always said this. So I spent all the many years in a bunch of different industries, and I thought I understood customer empathy and understanding customers. And that was until I got into the pest control industry. Then I thought, wait, we are sending men and women to your home, and often to parts of your home where you have never been. And that requires an entirely different level of customer empathy, customer listening, customer understanding than anything I had ever been through in my life.
Yeah, and right, I mean your home was a very private space for
Yeah,
most people, right? And so to have someone coming in there and really going into all parts of it is, for some people, almost like an invasion, but it's better than the invasion of insects
of
that they're
ants. Yeah,
experiencing, or other pests.
yeah.
So you mentioned earlier that there was an explosion of companies trying to be innovative and come up with new ways to help hiring, particularly for remote hiring. But regardless of where you are today, because a lot of companies are either hybrid or they've gone back to brick and mortar, some have just stayed all work at home. Regardless of that, what kind of tools should companies absolutely be using in part of their pre-hire recruiting and hiring and onboarding processes?
Well, I'm going to actually go back to what I talked about earlier about effort and friction at the candidate application level. And I'm going to say they can deploy a ton of different tools to figure out, like assessments and trying to find out, um, make people go through testing. But in my experience, all that is going to do, that is going to, and I've seen a couple of iterations of this through the last couple of decades, that will do more to homogenize your workforce than it will to give you a better candidate. And what I mean by that is, at the end of that experience, you have everybody that looks the same, that sounds the same, and certainly like where we are in California, and the city that I live in is one of the most diverse cities in the entire country. And so hiring in this area, you want your employees to look and sound and act and come from the places where your customers will. And I'm always a little leery of putting too many assessments and technologies, making people take a DISC profile, although I'm a fan of DISC, or PI test, just to kind of place them for one that causes some undue stress and burden to the team member. Like if you're going to review their experience and you have a well thought out interview, I think that makes more difference than anything. And to the very long answer to your very short question, I would say make the candidate application experience the simplest you can. Make it as bare bones, get as the least amount of information that your organization is able to get, and then get them into your system to be able to do some kind of scoring. And look, sometimes in my prior role, if we posted a position, we were going to hire a class of 10 team members, we would get 250 applications in just a week or so. And so we would generally only leave it open for a week. But having a very well thought out, very deliberate interview process, I think that is worth far more than any technology you can put up front. And I have seen that pay dividends. And what I mean by that is understand who's going to ask what questions, how are you going to pull everybody back together to get the feedback? Is everybody going to have the exact same interview experience? Putting time and effort and energy into making that a very deliberate, very structured process is far more valuable than putting tons of technology in front of the candidate. But then after that, I'll say, then you get a ton of bang for your buck if you put that technology into a damn good onboarding and day one experience technologies. So anything where because people are onboarding electronically, anything where they can do their W-4 and their I-9 digitally, anything that they can, like the things we used to do in brick and mortar, set up their direct deposit day one, even submit a picture for their company badge or for the company intranet and things like that. And there are a ton of tools out there that that make that seamless, and that's where you're going to get far more advantage. And then the other thing I'll add to that is any technology that'll onboard people to systems with usernames and passwords sooner is better, because in any large organization, starting on day one and then not having access to anything, especially when you're in a group and you're in a training class, that's just mind-boggling. But yeah, that I would put the emphasis on building a very well-structured, meaningful, deliberate interview process. I think that will get you far more.
You brought up something just there at the end too that I think is in fact more important now if you are training in a remote or virtual environment, and that is the system access piece. Because when you're in a brick and mortar environment, I can still do this virtually. I can show you things, but you could, as I used to call it, have someone come up and drive, right? So that they're getting hands-on experience. Depending on the technology you're using, you might be able to screen share and give them control, but it's always better when they can follow along and do those things and access those systems themselves. And so that system access is absolutely critical.
Yeah. I'm not going to mention the company name, but I have a friend I've known for many, many years, and he recently went to work for a technology company that as a contractor, but everybody would know both his employer and the company where he's a contractor for. These are international technology organizations, and he was there for 3 weeks before he had system access. And then they sent him a laptop, and it was the wrong laptop to access that client's network. And you think about, and he's a systems engineer, and it's just mind-boggling, but that kind of stuff happens in contact centers. And it's one of those things, if you get the ball rolling, again, we talked about earlier, we're damn good at forecasting. We say we're going to need this volume in week 23 of the year 2023. Let's back that up. How long does it take to onboard and train? How long does it recruit? When do we need to get equipment shipped? And then you can, and especially as many times as we've been through this the last 2.5 years, we should be able to execute on that pretty good.
Yeah. And that onboarding experience, I don't think people understand how critical that is to your retention.
Oh yeah.
Both in the short and the long term, because that is like, that's the first date, man.
Yep.
If that first date doesn't go well, you might get kicked to the curb.
I'll tell you this. So everything we do in my organizations is very deliberate. We ask questions. Why do we do that? Why is there a reason? And if sometimes we say, let's try it a different way. And I will tell you one of my little secrets that always makes HR teams scratch their head. And sometimes I've been in organizations that told me I can't do this. If I can, in the brick and mortar days, new hires always started on a Friday. Full stop. We don't start on Monday, ever. And there's a reason. And it's exactly what you just said, Rob. The first day, here's what we wanted to do. And my last organization, brick and mortar, was beautiful. The the most beautiful building I've ever worked in my life. And so day one, we had some goals, and we said, here are the goals. We want you to know where the kitchen is. We want you to know where all the coffee makers are, every coffee maker in the building. We want you to know where the restrooms are. We want you to know our evacuation and safety plan. And that's it. And we want you to know where you're going to come on Monday to start training. And that's our goal. And one of the questions I always asked our new hires was, on that first day, or on the Monday following, I'd say, what, if you don't mind sharing, what did you tell your friends and family about your job? And you get great insights, but the difference between starting on a Monday and starting on a Friday is you have given them an extra day pay, but you have also given them a weekend where they don't have to stress. Because imagine if you're starting a job on a Monday, you're like, oh man, what am I going to wear? What am I going to do? Man, I'm anxious. I'm not going to get any sleep. But you start them on a Friday, and you say, oh, by the way, Fridays, everybody wears jeans. It's, we have donuts and bagels in the kitchen. And then they show up on Friday, and everybody knows, because everybody in the building knows my team starts on Friday. And everybody's giving everybody high fives pre-pandemic, and everybody's introducing themselves. And then you have this energy because it's a Friday. And then again, all they know is this is where the building is. I got my W4I9. I got all that done. And it's very deliberate so that they have that weekend, like, man, I just started this new job and I feel good. I met people. Well, when we went to virtual, we tried to do it on a Friday, the very first class, and it was a disaster. Because none of the technology, some of the things like our single sign-on to some things didn't work on the first day. So we just said, okay, we're going to start them on Thursday. And then it became, it was just, so then Thursday was just a day to, if you were local-ish, you could drive in, get your computer, get it set up in the building, and then go home. If you were further away, we would ship it to you. We'd get on Zoom just as an introduction, get to know you. And then that Friday was a little lighter day, but it was that same kind of concept that you weren't like rushing to get there Monday at 8 o'clock kind of thing. And being deliberate about that was, we saw that have a huge impact, because you're right. That first day, you want them to leave like feeling like, man, I feel great about this. And not that you can't do that on a Monday, but I have had much more success doing that on a Friday.
Yeah, that's really insightful. And I think what organizations should just do is always be willing to think outside the box. And as you say, right, be very intentional about it. What am I trying to accomplish? And how does this help me accomplish that?
Yep.
So let's talk about the bottom line. This is definitely in the news. Let's talk about wages.
Yeah.
How have you seen that impact hiring in the contact center world?
Well, I'm in California, so I can say that it has impacted us on the coasts, both coasts, to a different level than maybe the rest of the nation, where the majority of those contact centers are, by the way. But I can say this: so when we minimum wage changed to $15 an hour, and we had a stair step to get there, right? And so one of the things that I did several years ago was I said, everybody in my organization will get an increase. Everybody that's hourly will get an increase in step with that minimum wage. And that took a long time to get approved, because it was not, at first it made sense, but then we looked at the numbers like, this is going to cost us real money. We said, we understand that, but if somebody is at, when minimum wage was $11 an hour, and they were at $15 an hour, if we just left it to their own devices, then that would shrink, right? So we always said we never want any pressure from anybody feeling like they're close to minimum wage. It didn't matter if they were at $19 or $20 an hour, they would get the same incremental increase. We called it a market increase, which is different than merit. And every time minimum wage went up, they went up. Everybody that was hourly, all the team members on the phone. So we did that, and we did that. We planned that several years ago without the pandemic in our mind. And when the pandemic happened, we realized, thank goodness we did it, because we couldn't in our market when we were hiring brick and mortar. We were hiring for maybe at like $18 an hour, $17 to $18 an hour, and there were organizations that were saying we're hiring at $15.50 because minimum wage was at $15 an hour. And we said, no, we're going to bump it up more. We're going to bump it up more. And we realized that it's certainly in the market where we are, you get what you pay for. And what I mean by that is people aren't going to apply for your job if you're paying $1 or $2 over minimum wage. And even if that might be $17 or $18 an hour. And look, we talked earlier about you being from Kansas, and I've talked to some people in the ACCP on both the Missouri side and the Kansas side, and I'm aware enough about Kansas's labor laws to know that you could probably fit it on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. There's not many, and certainly as it comes to pay, I think they might just be at the federal minimum wage, and so that's a challenge for recruiting. But out here, that is very tough. But what I have seen more than anything is contact centers, team members that want to work remote. In the beginning of the pandemic, there are people that worked in California that said, "Oh, I can work for a Florida company or a Georgia company or a Texas company." And now that's I still spend a lot of time looking at contact center team member jobs posting everywhere, Indeed, LinkedIn, all the job sites, because I want to see what the competition is. And more of them are starting to say, we only want in state or in region or in time zone. And sometimes that's a way for those other states not to get California, pay California wages. And sometimes it's also, our laws around time off, around leaves of absence, those things for large contact centers can make it prohibitively difficult to do business here. And I understand that, but certainly we have seen the wage pressure. We have seen wages go up. We have seen I also am sit on the steering committee for the Northern California Contact Center Association. Half of our members are public institutions, so state, local, county governments, some federal, and the rest are smaller contact center operations, 100 seats or, slightly over or under, not any of the mega centers. And they've all seen, at least in the private sector, have seen wages continue to skyrocket. And I think that makes California a challenging landscape. Again, not necessarily just California, but the West Coast and the East Coast, I think, especially the Northeast, probably share a little bit of the same of that. But it's starting to get to where, and I think it's the reason why most contact centers, at least the ones that I know people at and have seen in California, are still remote, because it has been, although everybody else seems to want to get people in the office, every week or so, there's articles about, large tech companies out here that are trying to get people back a couple of days a week. I don't think contact centers are doing that much out here, because that becomes a retention tool. Like, okay, well, we may not pay you $25 an hour, but we will let you be fully remote. And I think that's a benefit. I think that's the reason we, at least in California, might be seeing far slower move to hybrid and far slower move back to brick and mortar.
Yeah. I can speak to the Midwest a little bit as well. Obviously, being in St. Louis, I think what we've seen is, as the, Amazons and Walmarts, who are a totally different business, right? You are definitely in a building, whether that's as a store associate or you're working in a warehouse, whatever the case may be. But as they start to move toward, saying, well, we're just going to pay 15 minimum across the board, and then make some adjustments from there, depending on geography, right? I mean, I'm sure they pay more than that on the West Coast. But that pushes up the pressure, because at the end of the day, a lot of times contact centers are competing for those same people that might be considering those jobs. And so, yes, if I'm work from home, that's a big advantage. And I might be able to pay a little bit less, because you don't have to drive, you don't have to pay gas to get there, you don't have maintenance, you don't have a commute, whatever the case may be. But if I can make $15 here, or I can only make $10 over here, and it's work from home, like, I'm going to make $15. Yeah. That's going to happen. Yeah. I've even seen local government really struggle, because they're, they have their own contact center people for different things, like unemployment, for instance. Yep. And I think they're only paying like $10, $11 an hour, and then they
Oh,
wonder
wow.
why they can't keep people. Well, because that's not really the prevailing wage anymore, regardless of what the minimum wage
Right.
is. You're competing with the
Yeah.
prevailing
Yeah. The
minimum
market.
wage. Those market forces are driving things. So I think, um, if you're struggling with attrition, there are a lot of things to look at, but certainly wages are one of them.
Yeah.
So, aside from wages and doing onboarding differently, what are some other things that contact centers can do to be more attractive as employers, to be, employer of choice?
Well, I love this question because it's one of the things that I think that we as an industry should always be asking ourselves. And one of the things I've learned years ago is to ask people what they're interested in. And then you learn pretty quickly as trends change. And I'll tell you this, you mentioned earlier that in some markets you have you're competing for the same candidates that might be applying for warehouse jobs. Where I live, we are the second busiest transportation and logistics hub in the United States, second only to Houston. In our proximity to the Port of Stockton, the Bay Area ports, and the freeway system, there are more warehouses here per square mile than virtually anywhere else in North America, which is good because my wife is in that business. It's good for our family. But we have seen in the contact center space, and certainly where I was, and then in some other organizations that I have had some conversations with, we don't draw as much from that. But it is so important, going back to being super deliberate, to find out who your best candidates are. And I mean, to generalize that persona, we all talk about, like, let's identify the personas of our customer to do a journey map. But what about your candidate? Like, what's the story of your candidates? And that will help guide you into, where are these people? Where are they? Where can you market to them? How can you help them join your organization? And one of the things that I found in my last organization, our bread and butter, our best choice or best chance of getting incredible candidates were people from restaurants and retail. Here's why. We paid a little bit more. Well, oftentimes, if it was fast food, we paid a lot more, but we paid more, but we gave them a thing that their restaurant and retail jobs could never do. We gave them a set schedule.
Mm-hmm.
And it was super important to us and our team that we gave people a set schedule, even though we were 7 days a week. And during the week, it was in the first shift's at 5:30 in the morning, last shift ends at 8 p.m. And we worked Saturdays, Sundays, even though they weren't the greatest hours, you knew what they were. And having worked restaurants and retail before I started contact centers, and having worked in some contact centers where we didn't have that luxury years and years ago, I realized that that is a huge benefit. And when we realized that that's a benefit to our candidates, then restaurant and retail people were who we were focused on. Not only that, but we have often said, if you work in a Taco Bell anywhere in Northern California, we want you to apply for us at our last job, because something about their training and the way that they hired people, the Taco Bells, and there's a couple different franchisees. We had incredible results from people that came from Taco Bell. But even, people that came from Starbucks, people that came from full service restaurants, people that came from retail, especially retail that had any seasonality to it, because they would realize that although we have seasonality, the seasonality in our business was, we had unlimited overtime in the summer that was voluntary.
Right.
And it didn't mean that they were getting laid off in the winter. But understanding who and why those things were important. So we put a ton of attention on, let's make sure we get a set schedule, and you're going to have that set schedule until we do enough hiring that then you get next. And the only thing we based on tenure was your schedule selection. And we were very clear about that. Everybody knew, and we were able to get people to be interested because they knew. And they knew that 9 weeks from now, on Tuesday, they were going to work until 8, and then Wednesday and Thursday they were off. Like, they knew that. But the other thing we found was, if we really want to compete, especially in the work from home when people can work for a ton of other contact centers, we want to be the best. And here's another number that I don't know too many contact centers that measure this. What is your PTO approval rate? And we wanted to be the highest approver of PTO of any of our competitors. Competitors meaning anywhere that you could work, which meant If you work and you had split days off, let's say you had Tuesdays and Sundays off. And then you said, well, you know that that's your schedule, and it might be your schedule for 4 or 5 months until we hire enough people where we start doing schedule shifts or shift changes. Well, if you know that 8 weeks from now you're gonna work Wednesday and Thursday, but you have something going on, put your request in, and if you put it in 3 months in advance, there's a 99% chance it's gonna get approved. And here's why: if it doesn't work, if we put it in the system and it's like, no, we have too many people off that day, the leadership team will then fight for you and advocate for you to find a way to get you to have that day off. They'll find shift trades. They'll find other people. They will find a way. And we got to be where, even with it, when it was within a couple of weeks of the request, 80+% were approved. And what that created was this culture where people were like, oh man, I know it's short notice, but this thing just came up and I want to take next week off, but there's 2 days that I can't make it. And then if we declined it, we would decline it, and then we would go find you a person. Because I found that it was easier for us to find, and somebody would say, okay, I'll work half of that day and half of this day. We found somebody else to work this one and that one. And what that meant was the person that got the benefit, the next time they heard that Joanne needed next Friday off, she's like, you know what, Joanne really saved my skin last month. And it just creates this thing where we would tell people, and we tell people in the new hire process, look, here's what your schedule will be. And it'll be that for likely 4 to 5 or 6 months. And if you need a day off, you tell us before you get hired, we'll approve every one of them. Everything gets approved before hire, no matter what it is. And then if you get hired and something comes up and you want to put in a day off, we have a astronomically high approval rate. It's not 100, but it's pretty darn close. And people cared about that time more than virtually more than anything. Pay is important. You have to pay people. But outside of that time off flexibility was far more, because we can't be flexible, right? This is not an asynchronous job. Calls come in, texts come in, emails come in, you have to have people there. But as close as we can get to making it feel like it's asynchronous and that you're going to get your time off request, that has a ton of value.
Yeah, I also think it just speaks to valuing that work-life balance, which we hear a lot about. And when you as an organization make an effort to understand that people have lives and they have other things they want to do besides their job, and do your best to accommodate those things within reason, that becomes really attractive.
Yeah, it's funny you brought up work-life balance, because I always, years and years and years ago, I had a boss, Alex Mitchell, that told me I was working too late. I was a senior manager in a contact center. This was 20+ years ago. And I was there really late one night, and he walked up and he tapped me on the shoulder. He handed me a piece of paper, and I went to unfold it. And he said, no, just wait. And then he left, and then I unfolded it. And it was, remember the hangman game? And it basically had 2 letters filled out, but it was clear that it was go home. And I always remember that. And he taught me, he said, man, forget work-life balance. It should be work-life separation. And so I always tell, when we went work from home, I always told my team, like, I have to remember, we talked about work from home, work from anywhere, work remotely. It's more than that. It's work invasion, right? It's now, we have now invaded your space, especially if they're on webcam during meetings. Yeah. We have invaded their space, and having that separation is crucial, and being able to tell people, yeah, if you need the 3rd Tuesday of next month off, we're going to fight like hell to make sure that you get that off. And people absolutely value that.
Yeah, 100%. Matt, we have talked about some amazing things today. And hey, organizations, I hope that you gained something from this today. And Matt, thank you so much for joining me and sharing these insights. It's been great.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. I very much enjoyed the conversation.
All right, well, that's it for this episode of Next in Queue. We'll see you again next week. Next in Queue is brought to you by Happy To and is produced by me, Rob Dwyer. If you enjoyed this podcast, please feel free to subscribe or rate in iTunes or your favorite podcast app. But more importantly, please tell just one person about this podcast. Word of mouth is the best way for people to discover new content. Thank you for listening.